Hello, everybody. Welcome back to the Airsoft Mechanics Podcast with Ryan and Ryan, Legacy Airsoft and the Airsoft Tech. It's been about, I think, 2 weeks since our last one. Both of us are pretty busy, so every week might not work out, but we'll at least try for every 2 weeks. So yeah, we'll just kind of start off by talking about what has been our airsoft updates in the past 2 weeks. So I'll let Ryan chime in there and see what he's been doing for the past 2 weeks since he's been back into it.
Yeah, of course. So the main thing I've been doing is actually trying to get more into SolidWorks. So I kind of mentioned it a little bit last time. I think I did. If not, maybe it was in one of my own videos. But I'm decently proficient in CAD design and CAD programs, but it was the last couple months I've been sorry, I was gonna say co-op, but co-op's a term that my college uses. I don't know if everyone uses that, so I'll say internship, for lack of a better word, with an engineering company, and they use a program called Creo. So Creo is fundamentally very similar to SolidWorks, but a lot of the buttons and controls are just different, or like the names they use for the same functions are different. So I had to kind of relearn how the program worked. And then at home, when I want to do airsoft stuff, it's back to SolidWorks because that's the local file that I get through my university. So I've been trying to relearn SolidWorks through CADing a sector gear and a tappet plate. The tappet plate I actually made a video on my channel that any of you guys can view that was a complete step-by-step walkthrough of exactly how I did it. And I don't know if I'm going to do this for future stuff, but the way I did that video was I talked as if you did not know how to use SolidWorks. So I not only showed you how to make the tappet plate, but I explained like every single step and every single button I clicked in the program and why, as if like someone who does not know how to do CAD at all can watch that video and just do it from start to finish. If I do more CAD videos in the future, I'm probably not going to do that approach because it took a long time. The video was like an hour and 45 minutes long, and the actual tappet plate part I could have done in like half an hour if I wasn't explaining everything. If you want to view it and you know how to do CAD already, just watch it in 1.5 or 2 times speed and you'll get the same info out of it. The sector gear that I've been learning was a lot harder. So if you guys have never model gears before, you'll know that the spur style gear, and I say that in quotes because I know for airsoft we just kind of call the step gear the spur gear, but spur is a style of gear. It's a cut of gear. It's not specifically that gear we use in airsoft. It just is a spur gear, so we call it that. In order to design that style of gearing, the gear teeth commonly have a profile that's called an involute curve or an involute circle. And if you ever pick up one of your airsoft gears and you look at it closely, you'll notice that the gear teeth, they're not straight. So I'll kind of try and model with my hands, right? Each tooth does not look like this. It's not like a straight surface triangle. It's actually, there's like slight curves on it, and the gear tooth follows a profile. And there are mathematical equations that kind of determine what that profile is based on other characteristics about the gear. So I'm debating if I do a video on how to model the sector gear, because the sector gear itself, if you don't include that part about the tooth profile, isn't actually that hard. It's pretty straightforward and pretty simple. But once you get into that profile of the tooth and getting that exact to the involute circle kind of profile, that way it properly meshes and there's no issues there. That in itself is kind of a topic. So I might do a video on that next week, just kind of explaining what that is, why you need it, and how to model it in CAD. But I kind of spent a lot of this week learning about it myself and just double checking the knowledge I learned in school and kind of trying to go a step further than what I did in school to better understand how to model it in CAD and things like that. Unfortunately, I haven't done too much airsoft building. Actually, I think after this podcast ends tonight, I'm going to go back to my desk and finish putting together one of my DSGs. I've made a video about like kind of part one of just taking it apart and seeing what the inside was like, because I hadn't opened it up in a long time. And I'll probably put it back together and finish that up tonight and have a video out at either the end of this week or beginning of next week on that. And I've been rambling for a bit now, so I'm going to throw it back to Ryan and he can tell you what he's been up to.
So, it's funny because he's been doing SolidWorks stuff. You guys know I do not have access to university fancy programs like SolidWorks or anything like that. So I've been trying to learn how to use Blender, which is kind of a free uh, 3D creative software that can actually export things in STL, which would be the thing that I'd want to print stuff in. So I've been watching a lot of Blender Guru in the slow nights at work, learning how to model a donut. That's pretty cool. Um, it's very interesting doing that from the standpoint of not having like not being an engineer, because everybody I know that does it is an engineer, like or engineering student at least. So that's Ryan. I have a couple friends that do it too, and they use SolidWorks and I can't remember. There's another one that they use. Fusion 360.
Fusion
is one
360 is
that
the
one of
other
my friends.
popular one. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think that from what I understand, a lot of people are liking Fusion 360 a little more than SolidWorks, but I don't know. That's just
Yeah,
hearsay
the
from
thing
what
with
I've heard.
360, and this will be like super, super short aside, like 10 seconds. I like SolidWorks a lot better, but Fusion 360 is free. SolidWorks for an individual license costs like 10 grand. So depending on the license you want to get. So it's not even an option unless you get it through a university or like your workplace. Um, so Fusion 360 is not bad. It's actually pretty good, but it's the fact that it's easier to acquire for an individual is why people tend to like it more, because you can actually like do it as a hobby at home without having to do it for class or stuff like that.
Yeah, that's definitely nice. Yeah, that's cool. And I also this is kind of like off topic airsoft related. I've always liked the idea of like three-dimensional modeling. It's something that I've always liked to watch YouTube videos on. Uh, there's a YouTube channel called Corridor Digital, and a lot of their
Oh, they're so
guys on there
good.
do. Yeah, they're awesome, and they have like a vlog style channel called Corridor Crew, and one of their guys on there, his name's Ren. He's a mechanical engineer, I think, and he does visual effects is basically his thing, and super sharp dude, and uses like I think he uses some Blender, I think he uses Cinema 4D, I think is what it's called. I don't know. I can't remember what that software's called. But anyway, watching him talk about rendering things and making different models, and everybody on there is good at that stuff too. But watching them talk about that stuff, it's gotten me really interested in it. And so I would like to, learn how to use this software so I could design tappet plates and I could design like, you know, air nozzles and cylinder heads and stuff like that maybe. Um, so yeah, I'm trying to learn how to use Blender, just because I've heard it's fairly easy to learn starting out, and there's a lot of YouTube videos on it. There's actually a YouTube channel called Blender Guru, where literally all he does is show you how to use Blender. So
Seems pretty
I've been
helpful.
watching that. I could, yeah, exactly. It's super helpful. So, um, but like in terms of airsoft build updates, I've been working on my TSG. It's actually a part on my desk right now. I can't really pan the camera and show you guys because the camera is my whole laptop. But I've got the base gun apart. I've got all the parts there. Kind of slowly working on assembling it and shimming it and that kind of thing. Doing all the fine tune work. I actually uploaded part one of the TSG build project, and that got really good reception, really good amount of views really quickly. So hopefully I'll be able to get the second one out probably next week, because I've got like 6 or 7 days off from work, so
Oh, there you go.
got plenty of time. So
Yeah,
that's pretty much my airsoft build updates.
yeah, I think for me, so I received my TSG gear and I received the T238 FETs. I have a V2 and a V3. I
Oh,
haven't
you got
tested them
two of
yet.
them?
I know we've talked about it a little bit. Yeah, so I have two of those boxes on my desk upstairs. And I'm trying to configure, so I'm trying to have my DSG build, my first one that I made a video on already, done by either tonight or tomorrow. I think either tonight after this podcast or tomorrow when I get home from work and kind of am relaxing, I'm going to finish that build, make a video on it, and be done with it. Then I have to choose what I want to do next. So I have two different DSGs besides for this one and the TSG build that I want to do. All three of those are like builds I have access to like quickly open up and start working on. I wanted to get the DSGs out of the way first, just to kind of mentally like go 1, 2, 3, get them off, put them to the side, make sure they're working. Because I'm sure the
Right.
TSG is going to be a longer project where it's like, oh, it's working, but it's not tuned properly, and it's going to be something for like you and I to go back and forth and maybe purposely try slightly different things and see how they work and what doesn't work and go at it
Yeah.
like that. And I also know that part of the reason why I'm getting into CAD and doing all this design stuff for Airsoft is one, because I just need more practice in CAD. I think CAD's fun, and anything to more practice is beneficial to me. But two, I'm assuming that we're gonna need custom stuff to make this TSG work. Like the whole point of the TSG is that it's not figured out yet. So in terms of designing things optimally for the DSG, even if that ends up in the end being redesigning the DSG gear itself. I know something I was talking about with Lori, or I guess I shouldn't say that. You guys know him as Mikey on YouTube. He and I were talking the other day, and a couple other people in our a group that we have, about potentially moving the position of the sector cam on the sector gear, and then combining that with changing the way that I would like to design a different tappet plate like I did for the other one that Ryan has, to work with this new sector cam position, to play with tappet timing and how long the tappet plate can be held back and how quickly it snaps forward and things like that. There's a lot of things that we're considering just because for us it's more of a fun project. Like a lot of the people that you see, like I just kind of came back to Airsoft and this was one of the main motivators. Ryan came back not too long ago and he's jumping into this project. Mikey is the figurehead behind it for the most part. He's the one that's actually designing these gears and kind of pushing the project along. For us, a lot of this is just fun. Like it's not, I'm not trying to commercialize anything or get much out of it. It's more just like this is fun and interesting to me to play around with it, and kind of the whole CAD thing can let me design my own changes and not have to either go through another company and have them do it for me, or buy a bunch of parts and buy like 10 different RetroArms tappet plates and modify them all slightly differently to see what I want to do. And then the thing with modifying things is once you take away too much material, you can't add it back. It's much more powerful for me to learn how to CAD it myself, 3D print it, and then test it. And that just seems fun to me. So that's kind of the avenue I'm taking on it. The only restriction to that, and why I said I still might do the TSG next, even though it's going to take a long time, it would push back all my other builds, is because once I go back, I think around the middle of January, I move back into my apartment. I'm currently living at home due to COVID with my parents right now. And when I move back into my apartment, I will no longer have access to any of my tools or my workbench or my airsoft guns or anything like that. So whatever project I'm working on, the actual physical, like putting the pieces together and tuning an airsoft part, will be on pause for about 4 to 5 months before I pick it back up again. I will still have other content to do, and that's kind of where a lot of this CAD stuff can fill the gap, among other things. But the actual building will have to pause then. So I guess we'll see what happens, but continuing to kind of edit things, and like for example the tappet plate that I designed and that Ryan printed and Ryan's going to test on his end, we found out that it actually fit a lot better than expected on like the first try, but it's still not perfect. There's still things about it that we need to edit and fix, and like we didn't expect it to be perfect. So Ryan's gonna do some more testing on his end. He's already done a little bit and give me some feedback, and I'm gonna kind of keep tweaking and modifying the design on my end, and we can test new things that way too. Because I think we talked about this last time, but Ryan does own a 3D printer, and I have the CAD software and the design skills, so that's kind of how we're going back and forth with it right there to test this out. So yeah, that's kind of my TSG update. Tappet plate's the big focus right now, and then potentially playing around with the sector gear, like the TSG sector gear itself, and seeing if I can play with the timing on the cam. I'm not super focused on other components of the build right now, just because the only other thing that's specific to the TSG and would be like different than any other DSG build, I guess besides for the MOSFET, because that's I will admit I don't have the skill, I think, to program my own MOSFET and to kind of make that more advantageous than like the Gate Titan or the T238s or what's already out there in the market. So that realm is kind of, for me at least, more drop and play. I'm sure other people have that skill on their end and they can modify things there. I can't right now. So for me, the only other part I'm even looking at right now with TSGs is the piston timing, and there's really not too much to modify there. I think maybe we think of something that I'm just outside the box that I'm not thinking of right now, but for the piston, it's much more so that the piston timing isn't the issue. It's matching the tappet plate timing to the piston timing. Like, the only way I can really play with piston is by changing the spring or changing the sector gear itself, which we're already looking at. So I'm focusing on the sector gear and the tappet plate mostly. Yeah.
I was gonna say, or changing the weight of the piston. That's one of the things.
Or actually, that's a good one too. The weight can delay timing, and vice versa. If you make it lighter, it can increase timing, which is probably the route that we would try and look at.
Which I've been thinking about that. I've been wondering about how significant of a change that would be. Like, let's say that if I took this SHS piston and I minimally weighted it, like just no weight at all on it, like, you know, full, like as skeletonized as it could be with as little weight on the piston head as possible and removing as many teeth as possible, how much is that going to affect my piston going forward in the end? You know, like, because here's the thing though, because here's the thing, the reason why I talk about that is because like, I used to do all single stroke high speed builds and DSG builds by lightening my piston like as much as I could. And then I tried not doing it one time for one of my personal builds because I was lazy, and there was no issue with premature engagement, because that was basically the reason why we did that, was because we were afraid of hitting premature engagement and just wrecking the sector gear or wrecking the piston and basically having to redo the whole build, or also protecting the front end of your gearbox shell. But I've talked about this a lot. Nowadays, that's not really much a concern. We've got Lonex version 2 gearbox shells that almost never break. And then if you do need something even stronger, you can buy Retro Arms version 2 CNC'd out of 70-75 aluminum. So like, you're not going to break a gearbox shell.
We also have those STS systems now too that can kind of brute force your way through. I can use an old Combat Machine gearbox, which used to be made of paper, like the really old, the 4, 5, 6, 7-year-old ones. I can throw that in an M190 DSG, put a STS in it, and like the shock transfer system, the STS, it's not going to stop the gearbox shell from breaking, but what it's going to do is once it breaks, it's just going to lock it in place, so nothing actually happens. And a big reason why those gearbox shells used to break too, I found, is that it actually had something to do with the cylinder heads too, way back when. So when your cylinder, I think you know where I'm going with this. So in general, and I'm only going to mention this because it was a topic that I saw brought up on the Facebook group, as well as like the little Instagram group I've been talking in recently, is that cylinders aren't supposed to, or not cylinder, sorry, the cylinder head, as you guys know, when you're installing a gearbox, it sits there, there's two constraint locations. And what I mean by constraint location is a location that like will lock it in place, and that is the front of the gearbox shell. So you can see what Ryan's holding up right now, what he's pointing to. That front surface, the cylinder head has to meet that surface. And the other point is the little nub right there that the cylinder head kind of sits on and locks into. And the way the nub works is that nub is meant for alignment. That nub is not meant to actually transfer any energy from the piston hitting the cylinder head. And the way that works is that if you were to erase the nub, the cylinder head would still sit there, but it would rotate. And it would slowly rotate and spin around in a circle, kind of back and forth, as Ryan's showing right now. And what that does is that will throw off the tappet plate, and it will put pressure on the tappet plate and make that snap, and kind of or make it lock up, which ruins your feeding. So the nubs are only supposed to stop the rotation. They're not supposed to do anything with the impact force of the piston hitting the cylinder head, and then that going into the front of the gearbox shell. And the reason why you can design it that way is that if the cylinder head is perfectly flush with the front of the gearbox shell and they're constantly touching, and there's no gap between it, there's nowhere for the cylinder head to move back and forth, all the energy will go through the front. It's when you have a gap there, when the cylinder head, as my left hand right here, stops, and then instead of being flush with the gearbox shell, there's actually a little bit of a gap. That means that every time the cylinder head, or the piston head hits the cylinder head, it's going to go like this every single time, and it's going to put all that impact force on the front of the gearbox shell, and that's what's going to cause it to snap. When you study forces and energy transfer and things like that, it's not... you don't just look at the force itself, because what you're thinking is, oh, well, the force is the same. It's just it's the same spring, the same piston, the same stroke. But the problem is that there's a difference between the impact occurring at the and when I say impact, obviously I mean the impact of the piston going forward, right? Of that occurring at the cylinder head, the back of the cylinder head, or of that occurring at the front of the gearbox shell, with the cylinder head going forward and hitting it. Because you have a lot more when the cylinder head's moving. A better way to think about it is think about the entire system being the piston head, and cylinder head moving together. I know it doesn't actually do this, but this is the better way to think about it, and hitting that tiny little thin gearbox shell. Whereas when it's the cylinder head locked, it's just the piston and the piston head hitting the thickness of both the cylinder head and the gearbox shell, and it's much more resistant to that. I know that's a little bit of a tangent, but that was kind of half the reason why a lot of those old gearbox shells used to break anyway. So both the material of the gearbox shell obviously matters, but also where the cylinder head tabs are in that position. If the tabs are designed wrong and they're too far back, or the cylinder head is designed wrong and it's actually too thin and it creates that gap, that will cause even strong gearbox shells to break. Or vice versa, it'll cause the tabs to snap. Like one will happen before the other.
This is one of the things that was wrong with the first and probably the second gen, I think, RetroArms version 2 gearbox shells, is that those were very poorly designed, and the cylinder head, if I remember correctly, was spaced a little bit further back, like millimeters back from the front of the gearbox wall. So all the pressure from that piston slamming forward due to that main spring was thrown on those nubs and not like equally across the entire front end of the gearbox shell. Mm-hmm. And so like those nubs would snap off on those gearbox shells because of that, and because they didn't actually fit well with cylinder heads. Like the nubs would be too large, or they'd be too small, or something weird. And people would just kind of make them fit, like just jam it down. They were like, well, it's a CNC aluminum gearbox shell. How could an M150 break it? Very easily if it's not distributing the force appropriately. That's like one of the things with energy transfer is extraordinarily important in mechanical processes. So like, for example, this 3D printed tappet plate, the way that it's printed is that all of the walls are printed in one direction, and the infill layer is also printed in the same direction, crisscross between each one, so that it flexes, but that everything takes the same amount of force at once, and that there's no point in which there is an unequal amount of force. So like, for example, when you slice STL files to create like an infill layer, or to create like a wall thickness, you can determine what the infill pattern will be. And on things that are like square or even circular, it's good to have like a honeycomb style infill pattern, because as you apply stress to that object, it's kind of equally distributed across the entire infill. Whereas if you were to do that with this, you would actually have corners where, as the tappet plate bends, those corners take all that stress. And so the lines in this actually allow that flexing to happen, because flexing has to happen with a tappet plate, but it also keeps its rigidity because there's no point in which it's constantly bending over itself. So it's like imagine constantly bending something over a crease, like a piece of metal. It's going to get weak across that point over time. And so like this is why people don't check this cylinder head fitment. Like it's very rarely checked by I would say beginner to average techs, because they just don't think about it, So this fitment here is very important for energy transfer purposes.
Because that used to be, I'm sure this is not the case now, but I know like a long time ago, SHS cylinder heads used to come with the hole cutouts to fit on the tabs were made too small. And a common modification is that you'd have to bore them out with either a drill or a Dremel or something. And
yep, that's what it is here.
Yeah, exactly. So that's still something that you kind of have to do sometimes. And that's not always the fault of the cylinder head. Just a very common thing in general, and it especially applies to Airsoft, is that when you have multiple parts made by multiple different companies, all the not only the tolerances, but the actual dimensions in the design are going to be slightly different. And let's say SHS, their cylinder head hole dimension was just slightly smaller than average. And then maybe I put it into a Lonex gearbox and their tabs were slightly bigger than average. When you try and put those together now, it's not going to fit. So it's not always like, oh, that means SHS did it wrong. It's like, well, it could have been a little bit of both. So generally, when you're mixing and matching so many brands of parts, you will have to do slight modifications of things like that. And that's also one of the reasons why, like, the Tappet plate that I'm designing for Ryan right now is I've been out of the scene for a long time. Like, my stock of airsoft parts that I have to get reference dimensions on is like not great. So the first thing I told Ryan is, hey, like, I'm gonna get this to you, but don't expect it to work right away. Like, there's almost a 0% chance it will work flawlessly right away. Even though I put all the dimensions in correctly, it's because I'm only pulling from a limited supply of parts to reference, and I'm going to need more input and more parts, and to kind of find the average dimension where everything actually is supposed to be and what tolerances on that would make it most compatible with everything. And that applies to any design or engineering, or especially hobbies, because a lot of hobbies, like when you're building your own car or doing RC boats or planes or cars or airsoft in this case, there's a lot of different aftermarket companies that will each make things based on the same design, but they make it their own way. And when you start basing things, like if I based my design off of an SHS Tappet plate, who based their design off of a Garter Tappet plate, who based their design off of a TM Tappet plate. You see where I'm going with this? Like, it's going to slowly deviate each time. And it also matters the manufacturing method. So even if my design is spot on, like in a hypothetical world where I have the most perfect design that's compatible with everything, if I choose a really crappy manufacturing method and they can't hold the tolerances to my design, it doesn't matter what I designed, it's going to come out slightly different. And that has a factor into it too. So when I'm basing it off of the SHS manufactured Tappet plate, I might even get like a sample of their Tappet plate that's even further off than normal. So like a lot of stuff goes into it to try and make everything compatible with each other.
It's pretty much the copy of a copy problem.
Yeah.
And it's not exactly the same, but essentially, Tokyo Marui designed everything to an original specification is the idea, and then everybody else, basically took their design and ran with it. And like talking about the Tappet plate, they were like, oh, the Tappet plate is X amount of millimeters wide, X amount of this long, and the fin is X amount of millimeters long off of the peg that it sits on. So it's like everybody's doing that, but then at the same time, there's manufacturing tolerances, and then somebody comes along and says, well, yeah, maybe we should make the Tappet plate like 1 millimeter thinner here. And then someone else comes along and is like, oh, that Tappet plate, we'll measure it off of this. And then it's eventually the copy of a copy problem. After 30 or so years, you really truly start to see it, like with the cylinder head up against the front of the gearbox shell.
Yep.
So,
and that's just stuff to look out for. And I think that kind of actually flows pretty nicely into the main topic we want to talk about, or at least one of the facets on it. So next topic to talk about is going to be like kind of how can you become an airsoft tech, and kind of more specifically where you can start and where you can find some reliable info. And why I said that might lead into it well is because the whole cylinder head thing, like what was actually causing those gearbox is to fail? Was it a lack in design of the gearbox or the cylinder head, or a little bit of both? And I think this is just true. I guess I don't want to get too like large here, but this is not a problem specific to airsoft. This is a problem that happens on all hobbies, all forums, even outside of little forums, but just in the general scheme of conversation, is that a lot of people, it's especially with ease of access to information today and how quick everyone expects to get confirmation on things, they don't always get their information from a reliable source. And by that I mean whether it's firsthand experience or facts or data. It's much more common to just kind of browse around until you see someone who gave an opinion that you either think fixes your problem, or it's what you wanted to hear, or it lines up with a preconceived idea or notion you had about what might be wrong, and then you kind of use that opinion as if it was a fact to base off of, and you kind of keep just repeating that, and that becomes the new answer for you. This happens so so much. I know in my experience, and I know in Ryan's too, of just misinformation spreading across forums and groups, and even videos in some cases. And knowing who to actually go to get reliable answers and reasoning for why things might happen. Um, this is just to go back on that cylinder head example. So I know that a lot of when that stuff used to happen, like I'm not talking about the recent retro arms thing where I think that the issue was like Ryan said, the tabs were breaking, but I know even way back when stuff like the front of gearbox shells would break, and people would just say, "Oh, it's because you didn't radius it." It's like, okay, well, yeah, sure, radiusing helps get rid of stress concentrations at the front of the gearbox, but I've ran G&G Combat Machine paper boxes with no radiusing fine. So like obviously radiusing wasn't, it might be a contributing factor, but it's not necessarily the only cause. So you have to go like, oh, what's the next step? It's like, oh, well, it must have been you put too big of a spring in it. And it's like, oh, and you can kind of keep going down these random kind of, I'm going to throw a dart at a board and figure it out. But until you actually open it up and look at it, and in this case we found out, oh, it's actually because there's a gap between the cylinder head and the air nozzle and the gearbox shell. And once we filled that gap, it never broke again. So like trying to find, this is called root cause analysis, and this is just a pretty common thing in many professions, whether it's engineering or nursing or teaching or literally anything. And sometimes I know for reliable info, obviously there's the info you're going to find on this YouTube channel is, I would say, pretty reliable. Info you'll find on my YouTube channel is pretty reliable. Any well-known tech at this point who's kind of made their name or made a staple impact in the airsoft kind of like hobby sphere should be decently reliably trusted, just because airsoft old enough now where like Ryan and I have been around for God knows how long. So anyone else who has a name that's, I don't want to say as popular, because popular is the wrong word and it's a bad measure of reliability, but as kind of like well known or dates far back enough to have the experience and to have the knowledge to kind of give an answer. I know this is like a really open-ended, like indirect way of answering it, but if you are not a new member, so I'll do this in sections. If you're not a brand new member to the scene, you probably already have an idea of like what forums are popular, what people help moderate the forums, what names you're constantly seeing answer these questions, what YouTube channels you've seen, whether it's mine, whether it's Ryan's, whether it's Mikey's, whether it's someone else. Umbrella Armory is a good example of people that have been around for a long time. I know they're different because they're a company now. They're not like an individual person, but you will eventually find out who is giving consistently right information and who is not just kind of following trends and repeating stuff that they've heard someone else say. But in terms of if you don't want to follow personalities or individual people, I know, damn, if we can revive. So this is kind of going off a different angle, but something that we've been trying to do behind the scenes is reviving the airsoft mechanics, the really, really old form that used to be the central hub for all the teching and the experimenting and data collection and stuff. If we can revive that, my direct, easy answer is anybody who gets verified on that website, whether it's through a verification tag or a moderator or admin status, they are going to be the most reliable people to follow. But we haven't done that yet, so I think that's a bad answer. I'm going to let Ryan take over before I keep rambling. But
all good,
that's where I'll start from. Yeah.
So it's probably the most difficult part of airsoft is actually finding people that can be a source of reliable information. Like extremely difficult. So like Ryan was saying, there are people in the community that are more trustworthy than other people in the community. And how do you determine who is the more trustworthy person? Well, I kind of think that people's actions can kind of speak louder than their words almost. So like, for example, when like in my line of work, for example, somebody who I work as a critical care nurse at a large city hospital, and so one of the things that we look out for is nurses that work with us that kind of have a lot of talk but not a lot of actual game, meaning that they can talk the talk, but when it comes down to it, when they're taking care of a very, very sick patient, whether they're on ECMO or whether they're just on a ventilator or CRRT or ECMO ventilator and CRRT, which I've done before, um, taking care of that patient and making them better at the end of the 12-hour shift is kind of a way to show that you know what you're doing. And so when I was young, starting into Airsoft, I took people's opinions worth more when they could show me that what their build could do. So, like for example, when I'm on YouTube and I'm looking up DSG build and I can see a DSG cycling at 70 rounds a second, and I can see it being in gameplay, I can see it being in on other videos, and I can see it perform with a consistent FPS deviation and stuff like that, and range and accuracy. Clearly, the person that built that knows what they're doing, because you cannot build something like that,
Mm-hmm.
get that level of performance, and not know what you're doing. So to kind of take that from my line of work in nursing, it's like, okay, this person took care of a very sick patient and the patient got better or didn't get worse. And so clearly they're doing okay, or they know what they're doing, you know? And so that's like applying that to Airsoft. It's like, okay, well, I can look up, if I were to look up Mikey on YouTube, I can look at all of his Airsoft builds, and all of them are really good.
He is
And
such a good
you
example
can
too,
break,
because he's done so many different things, and it's all
yeah,
on
like
YouTube. So you don't even have to go like through an obscure forum or try to go back to old forums that are now dead to say, oh, I know this star folder guy seems to be really smart. Let me try and figure out who he is on Facebook now. That's where everyone's active. Like, you don't have to go through all those convoluted ways. Like, so I'm saying it right here. Mikey is one of the most reliable sources of information. If you guys can talk to that guy, um, that's a hands down good way. And I want to echo what Ryan said about actually actions speak louder than words. Like, not just talking the talk or walking the walk. A lot of people are able to read a forum post and then regurgitate that forum post or that document. It does not mean that they
Mhm.
actually know why those things are true or the reasoning behind those the things that they read, but they can regurgitate that information now. So it's really, really easy to watch a step-by-step guide on how to create a decently high round per second gun, and it's not easy to then diagnose specific issues that pop up, because that's a big fault in step-by-step guides, is that not everything works the same way. Anyone who's used one, whether it's for Airsoft or just for like school, doing a problem, trying to learn a new program or set up a game or something, there's always differences in what the person that did the guide had to go through and what you actually have to go through on your end. There's going to be extra steps, extra hurdles, something's going to be a little broken or not in the same place, or you have like a different version, so slightly different. If you get in the habit of just following things step by step and not actually understanding why they're doing what they're doing or what the reasoning behind the steps are, you're not going to be able to apply that to any other situation besides for that one in particular one you did. And another thing that Ryan brought up is, he did it indirectly. I'm going to be a little more direct in saying it, is that a lot of people will build a build, take one picture of it, do one 10-second chrono clip, and then they don't show the parts where it breaks the next day and they never work on it again. It's really, really hard to put out consistent and reliable builds, or I shouldn't say really, really hard, but you'll be surprised at how many people will post pictures or make it seem like they're pumping out all these high performance builds, and maybe like of the 7 they've built, only 2 of them didn't break within the first 2 to 3 weeks. And I say that because you're only seeing it through the lens of either a forum or YouTube or social media, where there is no follow up. You're not playing with them when they go to play and it breaks and doesn't actually work. Like for example, when I used to do a lot of prototyping and beta part testing for Retro Arms, Gate Titan, and a couple other companies way back in the day, I would build things that worked for about 30 seconds and then something would break. And that was just the nature of testing out prototype parts and like new designs and new concepts, is that they always weren't the most reliable, or even maybe the part was fine, but it was the method you had to install it was a little different. I didn't know that. So in the process of learning and experimenting, I would fail like a good chunk of times first until I eventually figured out the right way to do it. And sometimes kind of to wrap all those ideas together, you're not gonna know exactly who's the most reliable. You're not gonna know to go to the Airsoft Tech's YouTube channel or go find Legacy Airsoft's old forum posts and forum moderator and pinned guides and stuff like that. Or the legendary star folder on the old forums. Like sometimes you don't know to look for those things. So if you're just an actual beginner to the hobby, and the biggest advice I can give you for that is get as large of a sample size as humanly possible. So when you're looking for advice on how to fix something or how to implement a modification or what upgrade parts you should get or what's good, what's bad, don't just listen to the first couple replies you see, especially on social media, because I don't like to use the term hive mind a lot because it's kind of just a funny term and it's not always accurate. But a big chunk of social media gets their info from the same sources. That means that even if you get told by 20 different people that the SHS high-speed motor is the next coming of Jesus Christ and it's the best thing in the world, all 20 of those people probably heard it from the same exact forum post. So that's equivalent of being told by one person. It's really hard sometimes to filter through and to try and see, oh, well, I heard 35 people liked the post that said I should get this, so clearly that's the right one. You want to try and get as many different sources and different opinions as possible, and the next step is you always have to ask those people why. Why did they give you that answer? Because just getting the answer and being told that, like, oh, this part is good or this mod is good is not good enough. You have to understand why it's good, and that not only helps you in the future while you're learning and developing and trying to better conceptualize how all the parts interact and work together, but it will help you determine if the information is even accurate. Because if you have 3 different answers and 2 of the reasonings are the exact same, well, then you know one of them's wrong. And then maybe the third reasoning is completely out of left field. Well, now you're thinking about a new idea that you weren't even considering before. So it's just when you're new, or even if you're not new but you don't know what the actual right answer is, the best thing to do is to ask as many times as possible in as many different places as possible and try and get as much of a sample size of answers as you can, and then kind of use your own logic and reasoning, and maybe even test yourself and find out what's right and what's wrong, and then you'll slowly kind of build up your knowledge base and figure things out from there. Because that's how we had to do it. That was back in the day, because when the scene was much less developed, it wasn't even like trying to find out who's reliable. There was like 10 fucking people total. So that were actually like competent and regulars on these teching forums. So you kind of have to go through it a little bit that way, and just a little bit of trial and error, a little bit of logical reasoning, a little bit of casting a big net in a small pond and trying to see what you get.
One of the things I personally look out for was like on Instagram. It's especially noticeable. There's a lot of really good text on Instagram. First of all, I think that's a horribly overlooked social media platform for Airsoft.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm in communications with a lot of different people on Instagram for Airsoft purposes. Like for the TSG build project, that's where the main communication hub is actually, is through DMs there, which is a really weird place for it, but that's okay. But anyway, like one of the things I look out for whenever I see people commenting on my posts or saying something, like, hey, you might want to check this out. Like if I were to post like, hey, I'm doing this build and blah blah blah, and someone comments like, hey, make sure you check this when you do this build because of XYZ. I'll click their profile, see what their background is, and like a lot of times people that will comment on my video, on my posts or even videos, and leave a suggestion, a lot of the times they're engineering students or they're engineers. And I think that those two groups of people are probably some of the more reliable Airsoft techs.
Those are my boys.
Yeah, right. Is because they have a scientific, they have an analytical and a 3-dimensional analysis kind of mind. And so that's one of the things that's very specific to engineering, is that those people, at least good engineers, are very capable of closing their eyes and imagining something in a 3D space and recreating it in their head, and understanding tolerance issues too. And so like just for example, like in people's bio, they'll put mechanical engineering student, electrical engineering student, or mechanical engineer at so and so. And so like I know that they're probably a good airsoft tech, just because they understand stress and three-dimensional analysis and efficiency and how to achieve as close to 99% efficiency as possible. So that's something that I look out for. I'm kind of an oddball because I'm a nurse,
I was gonna
but
say I
I did go to
heard
engineering
nurses are
school for a year.
pretty good at being analytical and open-minded as well. I don't know if you can corroborate that, but
Well, I mean, that's kind of a personal, it's definitely just an experience basis, but like ICU nurses especially are very analytical and are very good at understanding how things just work. And
hmm
so, uh, like at least my line of work, it's like, okay, well, we really understand how the heart works, we really understand how the lungs work, we really understand how they work together. We understand when someone's starting to show signs of deterioration very early on. So we're good at that kind of thing, and that it doesn't apply too much to airsoft exactly, but like having an analytical mind definitely helps a nurse, just because it's all about, in the end, what is the best thing for the patient, and also a diagnostic mind, which is good to have in airsoft too, because you can diagnose a problem, because there's multiple ways that there's multiple causes or root causes for the same problem. So like low FPS, well, it could be your air nozzle is too short. It could be, it could be that your cylinder is reversed and your port is really close to the cylinder head. It could be your compression sucks. It could be tappet plate timing. Your tappet plate would actually not be
hmm
going far forward enough. There's all kinds of reasons. Your bucking lips might actually be caving forward in or something. There's all kinds of different root causes for the same outcome. And so having a good diagnostic mind definitely helps airsoft techs, which I think engineers tend to have, and so do ICU nurses. But
yeah,
I
one
don't
of
know many
like
nurses who also tech. So I know a
one
lot of
of
engineers that also tech.
I know one nurse that also texts though. He's pretty damn good at it. One
Nice.
of the one of the I fondest is the wrong word, but one of the most frustrated memories I have from like when I was first learning, and this is way before I even became an engineer, took any of those classes, or maybe even developed this mindset. But is I'll use the same problem you proposed. I have an air leak somewhere. My FPS was way lower than it should be with the parts that I installed. And I would go
Hmm.
online and I would look up a problem and I would say, "Oh, this guy says that it means that my piston head O-ring is bad." So I'd go in, I'd change that, put it back together, and the problem wouldn't have fixed itself. And I'd be like, "What the heck? He told me that was the issue." And I'd be like pretty pissed off that it didn't do anything. I was like, and instead of the first response being to go yell at that random forum post that was probably 2 years old already for a different problem, it should be to try and figure out, okay, well, that means there's probably multiple variables and multiple causes that can lead to an air leak, and trying to then backtrack from there and say, okay, well, I think it could be caused by A, B, C, D, E, F, or G, and then slowly go through each one of those scenarios and say, oh, well, I know that if it was my bucking lips being folded, I can check that right now by shining a flashlight down the hop up, taking it out, and looking at it. Nope, that looks good. Okay, next. If it was my air nozzle being too short or worn down or at an angle, I can also check that by taking the gearbox apart, putting the air nozzle on the tappet plate, pushing it all the way forward in the gearbox, and seeing if it lines up with the bucking when I put the hop up on the gearbox. Look at it. Nope, that actually lines up pretty well. They're making contact. So that's not an issue either. You can kind of go down the list and you can test each possible option. And eventually you're going to find one of them that doesn't hold up to the test. And you'll find out that's the case. Or sometimes you might find multiple. Because that's also an issue too, is that a lot of people just make the assumption that their issue is caused by exactly one thing and one thing only. And a lot of times that's not, a lot of times that is true, especially in airsoft, because it's not the gear, all things considered, the gearbox isn't super complicated, but that's not always true. Sometimes it's caused by multiple factors adding up together. So an example I'll give for that, let's stick into this whole air seal thing. Let's say that you're losing some air seal due to bad piston head O-ring seal, right? There's just, maybe it's old, it's worn out, there's no grease on it, it's starting to leak a little bit. Now, you also are losing some due to tappet plate timing. So that can be either that the tappet plate is starting to retract and get pulled back while your piston is still moving forward. So when the tappet plate moves back, the seal between your air nozzle and your air nozzle and your bucking, it separates and there's now a gap. So any air that comes out of your air nozzle at that point is just going to go right through and it's going to leak. So maybe it's that, or the other way tappet plate timing can be off is the opposite direction, which is that your tappet plate gets pulled back too late, in that your hold on, I don't want to say this. Or that tappet plate doesn't return quick enough is the better way to explain it. So that maybe the piston head starts to move forward and it starts to push that air down, but your tappet plate is still returning to the air nozzle. So until the tappet plate gets all the way back forward, any motion that your piston has and any air it displaces just gets completely leaked out of the system. And then once your tappet plate seals, then it will start to actually trap the air and use that air for compression. So sometimes it can be that plus the O-ring, and then maybe your air nozzle was also at slightly bit of an angle. So then just fixing one of those issues won't actually solve everything. It might make it better, but not all better. And the best way to explain that is, like, let's say you're expecting 400 FPS and you're only getting 320, and you replace the O-ring on your piston head and now you're up to 360. Well, yeah, that's better. So yeah, that clearly was an issue, but you still have a problem. And a lot of people will just quit there and they'll just say, hey, I fixed it, I'm done. But no, you can go back in, you can find the other reasons of why you're still losing 40 FPS somewhere.
Or they'll say, oh, it's just a weak M120.
Yeah, and then that's another thing too, is that
spring.
Some people will find excuses to say, oh, well, I tried everything, when the reality is they didn't try everything, they tried one thing. And then they say, so it must be just a bad spring or a mislabeled spring. In that case, that's a good example. So I would advise against doing that. And there is a way, I've been wanting to do this for a while. Maybe this will motivate me to do it. For example, the weak M120 spring argument only really holds up because, to my knowledge, there is no database that tells you what the spring constant of each respective rating actually is. So maybe I can find some time on my own to kind of do that and put that together, because springs are actually really, really easy to check if they're accurate or not. So when a spring is rated, let's do an M120 spring. So what that label means is it means 120 meters per second is the estimated output of a BB when you put that spring in an airsoft gun. That's what it means. So obviously that's a weird way to label a spring, because the FPS output, it's not just dependent on the spring, it's dependent on the air seal. And there's a ton of different air seal components. It's also dependent on, obviously, the BB and the volume. But so when you label springs, they make a lot of assumptions. And they basically, 9 times out of 10, they're assuming a 0.2 gram BB in perfect air seal or ideal air seal. So if you can meet those conditions, that spring should give you 120 meters per second. That's what that means. And what I wanted to do for a long time is just take those springs and actually calculate what the K value, for anyone who's taken physics, is of the spring. The K value is basically a spring constant that says that it is a constant value that is determined by the geometry and the material of the spring. So actually calculating it based on that is really annoying, and it's much easier to calculate it experimentally, where you can just say that the force applied to this, you can apply a known force to the spring, and that can be as simple as putting like a 20-pound weight on it and letting it hang. That would just be 20 pounds of force, right? So you can apply a known force to the spring and then measure the displacement, how much the spring stretches, and that will give you the K value. So I think the formula is F equals KX. So K would be F over delta X. So you divide the force you apply by the movement of the spring, and that gives you K. And K, if it's labeled correctly, should be literally identical for every single M120 rated spring, within reason. Like, obviously, there's going to be some tolerance. There's going to be slight differences if the spring is symmetrical pitch or irregular pitch or things like that. But for the most part, it'll be a fairly accurate number, and you can just do that for all the different spring ratings. And then what you can do, if you suspect you have a weak spring or a mislabeled spring, you can just put a standardized weight on it. I'll use 20 pounds again for this example, and measure how much it moves. And you can go look online and say, this M120 spring, I'm going to make up a number, I don't know what it actually is, has a K value of 7. And that means that with a 20-pound weight, it should move exactly 3 inches. And you can just measure it. And you can just see it doesn't move 3 inches. It does. That means it's actually an accurate spring. And my issue is with air seal. Or maybe it only moves, maybe it moves 7 inches. You can say, whoa, that is way weaker than it should be. Maybe I actually do have a mislabeled spring. I know I went a little hard on that, but that's like one example of just like, it's kind of a dead end in the hobby because people just haven't, people that understand how you would actually calculate that value and find it, by due to a lack of time or a lack of necessity, just haven't done that yet and like put together a document online to tell you how to test it. Or maybe someone has and I just haven't found it yet. That's also completely fair. But those little excuses develop and they kind of create their own like dead ends where you can kind of blame a problem on, in this case, the spring being mislabeled, when that's actually something you can pretty easily check.
Yeah, it's one of the things that's kind of actually one of the things I wanted to talk to you about was basically I think it'd be a fairly simple thing to do. Basically, just taking a factory labeled spring, varying strength, M90 to like M190, and then like putting it around a rod, and then basically putting a weight and seeing how many centimeters it collapses per each kilogram. And then I think by that way you could calculate, you could come up with a constant, like you were saying, and then kind of go from there to figure out how to actually calculate spring strength on and then determine from there if you do have a mislabeled spring, because that does happen. I mean, it's.
Oh no, it does happen, like
all the time.
100%. It does happen, but I feel like people use it more as an excuse, like you were saying, than it actually happening in most cases.
For sure. And so like it happens with lower grade quality springs like SHS, but like that's why I'm almost always buying Garter now, like always, because I find that they're on the dot, labeled correctly. Usually, I mean, I don't think I've found one yet that has a problem with labeling.
Yeah, another like weird flex, kind of based off the same idea, is that I know this used to happen a lot. I don't know if it still happens. Just haven't been following up with forums as much, but people used to, it was like a bragging right to say, oh, well, I only used an M120 spring, but I got 500 FPS out of my gun. And
you don't have an M120 spring.
Yeah, so the way that works, it's actually really funny people say that, because that just means they don't actually understand what the label M120 means. So as I explained earlier, M120 means it would be 120 meters a second, and for lack of having to want to do that math out, that's roughly 395 FPS, somewhere around there. It's really close to 400 with a 0.2 gram BB. And what that means is that, again, when that spring was labeled, when it was packaged and when it was labeled, the company is advertising that this spring will give you 400 FPS. So if you use a 400 FPS spring and get 500 FPS out of it, that does not mean you are some magic tech god that hit the lottery and just learned how to air seal better than the other 99% of techs out there. It means the company didn't actually label that spring either correctly, or remember how before when I was saying when they label it, they have to make a bunch of assumptions based off of air seal, BB weight, other things? It just means they use different assumptions than what your build had. So another thing what some companies will do, and this is why it gets muddy when you use different companies with the same labeling, is they won't use that perfect air seal assumption. They'll actually use the stock gun assumption, which, just for lack of better words, is what I call it. So what they'll do is they'll throw it in just a stock gun with subpar air seal, and whatever FPS they get out of it, that's what they label it. So if I were to put a spring in a stock gun that had an air nozzle with no O-ring, the piston head O-ring wasn't flush with the cylinder diameter, it was leaking a little bit by the cylinder head because there's no double O-ring, no Teflon seal, etc. Like a ton of different ways the air can leak. And that gun got 390 FPS. I would label that spring M120 before packaging it up and selling it. But that was an M120 spring in a leaky gun. So when a tech buys it and puts it in the tuned build that actually has proper air seal, they're going to get closer to 450, 460 FPS out of it, just by nature of they're changing what was used in the test. So that's actually what happened way back when people used to brag about that. It just means that they put it in a gun that was different than the gun used to test, or the company put the wrong spring in the box and they put like an M140 spring in an M120 box, which does happen sometimes. So that's kind of a little different, but it's just a funny thing that I remembered that came to mind when you were talking about it.
Oh, it definitely still happens.
It does still happen.
Definitely
Yeah,
still
it's
happens. Yeah. That's why I think it needs to be on like uh again, I don't know how exactly they are. I don't know the manufacturing process for these springs, but that's why I feel like it needs to be based upon like a compression rate. And so like an
yes.
MS210 spring is not going to compress as much with a 5 kilogram weight as an M100 spring. So like, or theoretically it shouldn't if they're both labeled correctly and the constants correct. And so like we should, it'd be nice if we would move to that kind of system if it's not already in place. And if it is already in place, then I'm kind of amazed that they can be mislabeled to that
Yeah,
degree.
definitely
So
a much better way to label springs. I understand why the current labeling system is in place because it makes sense for an airsoft context. Like at the end of the day,
right.
we have to realize that we are the minority. Most people in the hobby just want to have a gun that works, and their hobby is playing the game, not building the guns. Like at some point you got to realize that. So that's why a lot of marketing is geared towards the way it is that um people don't care. It's like a more accurate way to label springs, right? Would be to label the K value, that constant value, and then also the stock length of the spring before it undergoes any compression at all, like any push.
Yep.
Because I'm sure you've also opened up springs that you can get them at different lengths. So a spring that's a meter long, not a meter, let's just say like 2 feet long, and has a K value of 5, and then a spring that is 1 foot long and has a K value of 5. When you put it in the same geometrical constraint, meaning that, like in this case, let's say a gearbox, the 1 meter long or 1 foot long one will maybe squish to like that much when you put the piston in. So, but before even moving the piston at all, you've already have like, let's just say like a 2-inch delta X, but the 2 foot long one will have a 14-inch delta X. So even though they have the same K value, the delta X on them will be different. So it's just there's different, which means they're going to be putting a different amount of force back on the piston when it returns, which will mean that the one that's twice as long, because I picked a 2 because it's easy, it will result in twice the amount of force on pushing the piston head back, which will increase the acceleration, which increases the FPS by a ton. So just using K value is also inaccurate because that initial length actually affects the output. You have to put both. And the reason why force is a bad one to put on is because force is made up of those two variables, and you can't control the force. What you can control is the K and the length when you manufacture it. So if you were to label a spring, well, let's say like if you made a standard length in the airsoft industry, and I'll make up a number. Let's say every spring was exactly 1 foot long. That's a bad number because they all manufacture in metric, but I'm saying that every spring is 1 foot long. Then what you can do is say this is a K equals 5 spring, and that would result in like exactly like 400 FPS every single time. Or you could do it like that. And then if you didn't want to control the length, you could say this is a K equals 3.5, but then you have some denotation that says that it's a little longer than normal. So even though the K is smaller, the output FPS is equivalent to like a K equals 5. And at that point, it's like, oh, well, isn't that approximation and estimation kind of already packaged in just saying M120? And the answer is yes. So like the current naming scheme isn't actually bad. The problem is that the standards to which they make those names aren't the same. So it's like like I said before, one company will test their M120 springs in guns with perfect air seal, and another company will test it in leaky guns. So obviously those M120s are not both actually M120s. They're being labeled by different test methods. So I think the labeling is probably fine. It's the testing that needs to kind of be synchronized and made to be some sort of standard.
Yeah, I think if we can make them all the same length and then agree on like a constant, then I think that we'd be great. And
Yeah.
I just don't see that happening because it's not a big need in the community. Because for the most part, I'm okay with this current spring setup. The outcome is fairly good. I mean, it's good. It's fine. Um, and in terms of like the regular airsoft player, they just want their gun to shoot. So I
Yeah.
mean, like they just want to shoot straight. So yeah.
Yeah, and
Um,
that's That's what it comes down to, basically.
Yeah, I understand it. I don't need to be all elitist. The airsoft teching community is already quite elitist. So when I want to buy something nice
No.
like Siege Tech gears and spend $140 on them, I can feel great about shooting somebody across 100-foot range, and then I can also feel bad about getting shot by a gun that has $12 SHS gears. So
Yep.
it is what it is.
Airsoft.
Right. But I think, let me see. I'm checking our outline. I think that's pretty much that's more than what we planned on going over. So
Yeah, we definitely went on a few tangents.
that's okay.
And
It's a
I definitely
podcast. It's
rambled
meant
a
for
little
that.
bit, like I always do. But
I feel like this is an outlet for Ryan.
yeah, this is where I can get whatever was bugging me in the past 2 weeks that I saw online. I can like get it off my chest here and talk about it.
Right. This is basically the only place I can rant about airsoft because my wife just doesn't care.
Yeah, there you go. This is perfect.
She just doesn't care about all the guns. That's fine.
It's fine. You know, it's fine. It's fine. It's okay. It's fine.
It is what it is.
She doesn't have to know exactly why Siege Tech is the best thing in the world, and I will love them with all my heart. And SHS is awful, which is not true, by the way. But
she's
she
like,
wouldn't know.
Why did you need to buy the $140 gear set? Why did you need to buy the $140 pair of shoes?
Yeah, it's like,
But no, I think that's pretty much it. Do you have anything else to add?
I don't think I necessarily have too much else to add. One thing I will say about future podcasts in general is that if there's ever any specific topics that you guys would want Ryan and I to get into, maybe we can set up a more formal way of accepting topics and having you guys vote on it. I know Ryan's done a little bit of that on his Instagram account, but we can figure that out. But just for now, if you want to leave comments down in the description of these videos, and just let us know if there's either a topic in the community, common misinformation you want addressed, or just general topics that you want to learn more about and have our experience to speak on. Do let us know, because we will obviously try to include all that if you guys want to hear about it. And also on the topic of future of these podcasts, I think we're going to upload a few more on Ryan's channel, but kind of once we kind of get our footing back and make this more of a regular thing, we will eventually try to go back and forth between my channel and Ryan's channel. And we're also going to try and play with the idea of doing these podcasts live, and actually live streaming them. And kind of the idea behind that would be that we get to interact with you guys during the podcast. So any questions that pop up from you guys, maybe like one of the topics that Ryan was talking about, it sprung up a question in one of your guys' heads and you wanted that answered. Well, it's hard to do that when we just post a video, because all you can do is ask in the comments afterward. And maybe you could have asked during the podcast, and we could have answered it right there on the spot for you. So we kind of want to open it up to have more interaction like that. So if you guys think that's a good idea, obviously let us know. You talk about that in the comments as well. And I don't think we're going to do that in the next upcoming podcast, but it's down the pipeline. It's in the plan to do in the future.
Yeah. And a part of that is constraints on equipment too, and like timing and everything like that. I mean, I know we say it a lot, but both of us are fairly busy individuals, and it's kind of hard to always stick to a schedule. Partially because I never have a consistent schedule. I work 3 to 4 days a week, different days every single week. I could work the whole weekend one week, and then I could work the whole weekday, and then I could be both weekend and weekday the next week. So I mean, it goes everywhere. So I'm a little less predictable than most people's schedules, or unpredictable than most people's schedules. So
yeah, I think I think that's all we had to talk about. Anything else you wanted to bring up, Ryan, or?
No, I think that's about it. Yeah, just I'm continuing to try to make the content that I produce better. I understand people want good content and a good amount of the content, but I'm trying to find a nice middle ground between quality and quantity. So I hope you guys, the viewers, are finding the quantity and the quality acceptable.
Well, with that, guys, yeah, I think we'll wrap this one up. Like I kind of said. Oh, you say wait, or?
No, I said sweet.
Oh, sweet. Sorry.
Cool.
So yeah, guys, I think we'll wrap this one up. like we kind of said before, is anything you guys want us to talk about in future podcasts, let us know down below in the comments. Maybe we can coordinate putting together some sort of poll between now and the next podcast to kind of bring the topics to you guys, and if you want to vote on them or kind of write in your own and let us know, that can be a thing too. With that, I think we'll go. This is the second episode of us being back together, and hopefully it will spawn to a lot more of them in the future. We can kind of keep this to be more regular thing.
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you guys for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.
See you soon, guys.